I have returned for yet another podcast style video. It's been a little bit. It's been a little bit since I've done one of these, but I'm really excited to get back into it because, well, first and foremost, as you may have noticed, I actually have gameplay in the background this time. So, hey, that's a improvement from every other time that I've done this. So if you're a little bit more visual, then now you have something to look at while I'm actually talking. But what I'm more excited about is the topic of today's video, and something on the tongues and on the minds of all competitive and Power League players in recent times. It's Poco, and I don't know about you guys, but I have been thinking about Poco for like the past 2 days now, ever since the monthly finals ended. Has it been 2 days? I don't know, but ever since the monthly finals have ended, I have not stopped thinking about Poco because he is like as far as like brawlers that get buffed and quote unquote become insanely strong, because we don't even know how strong exactly Poco is, but of those brawlers that get buffed and get just like rise in the meta, he has been quite a perplexing case, and especially after doing scrims with the new Power League rotation, after doing playing Power League on my own, it's been a little bit interesting to figure out what exactly the meta is shaping up to be currently. So, well, first and foremost, if you're unaware, Poco recently got a buff. He got a damage buff, and it wasn't an insignificant damage buff. I mean, okay, so Poco got better, obviously, because he got buffed, right? But now his damage is, while he still has one of the lowest damaging attacks in the game, his attack is still very, very comparable to Sandy's attack damage. Now, Sandy's nerfed attack damage, but it's still close to Sandy's attack damage, reaching like 1100 damage at power 11, or 1200 actually, which is kind of ridiculous. It's kind of insane. It's like a 200 health buff for somebody who only did 1000 damage previously. It's pretty crazy. And now, I mean, Poco's whole thing is, I mean, he's not really a damage dealer, but it's a buff, and it gives him a better argument to be used, which means that his traits that he already brought to the table, now he's actually able to use them even more effectively. Now, well, what do I mean by that? So, Poco, right now, he's not like, oh, they buffed his damage, and it's not like he's suddenly this crazy, like, high damage dealer, melts your safe thing. No, it's just the damage buff, what it did to Poco is it basically just made it so that he's able to, like, 3-shot and screeching solo enemies way easier. So, like, brawlers that have, I think it's even up to that, like, surge health pool threshold, he's able to kill with that like 3-attack screeching solo combo. So he on his own is a little bit more threatening, prevents people from walking into his area of control, but he's also able to defend himself a little bit. People don't want to attack Poco as much because if they're on a little bit lower HP, then Poco can like burst them down, especially with the help of his teammates, which is the even more interesting part about Poco, which I'll get into a little bit later on. But that's basically the gist of Poco. He's not like this super high damage brawler, obviously. I mean, he still only does like 1200 damage per shot. Not enough to 3-shot pretty much like 80% of brawlers in the game, but it's still significant for the reasons I just went over. So, I did mention that this buff really lets Poco's already existing strengths shine. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think first and foremost is Poco, before this buff, pretty much, well, he was kind of bad, obviously. I mean, you had some people who played a lot of Poco in Power League, high Power League at that. I know I have a friend who plays with a teammate in Team Power League, and that teammate always spammed Poco even when he was quote-unquote one of the worst brawlers in the game. But when he was in that state, he almost always used Screeching Solo for whatever reason. I mean, DeCapo theoretically wasn't that bad, but I think Screeching Solo just gave him like a little bit of a push, right? It just gave him that little extra bit of damage that he needed in order to actually defend himself. But now, Poco can actually use Da Capo, and actually right now, Da Capo is being used and is often considered, well, by some people, it's pretty 50-50 as far as I'm concerned and as far as I've seen. But Da Capo has really come into its own as like at least an equal option to Screeching Solo. But personally, I think it is the better option. So Da Capo is now useful. So hey, that unique thing about Poco that he can heal with his main attack, hey, that's back in the meta. So that's creating some interesting dynamics. And Poco is like actual kit, like his star powers and his gadgets are really, really diverse. And it's like, well, most brawlers, or well, a lot of brawlers in the game have like, they have 2 star powers and 2 gadgets, and both of their star powers and gadgets are pretty equal. Like you can use them both, they're all viable. But like for something like Carl, for example, right? Like you do see people using both his flying hook gadget and his heat ejector gadget, as well as using both power throw and his shield gadget or shield star power. And I mean, obviously most people will consider that flying hook plus protective pirouette is the better combo, but really you can use any combination and it works, right? But what it doesn't do for Carl is using one of those star powers doesn't like actively change how the brawler plays, right? And that's something interesting about Poco, because Screeching Solo and Da Capo make Poco like a very, well, not like, obviously it's within the constraints of a star power, but as far as star powers go, it probably changed, like that difference between star powers probably changes how Poco plays, or how a brawler plays the most of any other brawler. And it's a very similar story with gadget. Both of his gadgets are, so one of them is for his good matchups and the other gadget is used for his bad matchups, which is like pretty much specifically Crow. And I'll get more into his bad matchups later on. But that is to say, as far as brawlers go, Poco's star powers, and one of his strengths is that his like his star powers and his gadgets are really, they're both equally good and they're really diverse in what they can do. So Poco can like fill a lot of different niches and a lot of different play styles at the same time in one pick. So that's what's kind of what exciting about Poco actually being meta. Now, where exactly is Poco meta right now? Well, I put down a few notes. So Poco is pretty much amazing on every gem grab map right now, every hot zone map right now. You can often see him being first picked, but maybe a little bit less so. I wouldn't say that Poco is necessarily the safest first pick, because I'll get into that later. Because Poco, if you've seen my Carl effect video, Poco has a sort of Carl effect on his own, but it's different. It's different. Okay, one thing at a time. So gem grab hot zone, he's amazing on these modes. It's very easy to control, get his chains of supers. It's very good to on these modes you see stacking mids really often. So in that environment, Da Capo can get a ton of value. His super can get a ton of value. So gem grab and hot zone, just play him on all of these maps. Open zone, even like the most ranged hot zone, theoretically, the most ranged hot zone map, Poco is amazing. And especially since the meta has been moving towards a more like mid-range style. So those sniper brawlers you don't really see that often in gem grab and hot zone anymore, especially in this new mid-ranged environment. Poco is pretty excellent. He's pretty great in Brawl Ball too. I'd say especially on Pinhole Punt. Dude, Pinhole Punt Poco is like, try saying that 5 times fast. Pinhole Punt Poco is ridiculous, especially since brawlers like Max and Leon are like super good on that map, and they're like these high movement speed brawlers that benefit a lot from Da Capo healing and tuning fork healing. It's pretty gross. So like Poco on, well, every Brawl Ball map, but especially Pinhole Punt is insane. And I wouldn't even discredit him on modes like Bounty and Knockout. We've already seen Poco showing up in competitive on maps like Layer Cake and Canal Grande, and I'm pretty sure he can be like a really sneaky pick in Knockout. In competitive, I believe in CESA ANZ monthly finals, we did see a Poco first pick on Out in the Open, and it won. Now, granted, it was a Mortis that carried that Poco team, but still, it shows that Poco really does have some, at least a little bit of weight in Knockout as well. So I would not discredit him anywhere, like pretty much anywhere. I think he's viable on every mode. Maybe the mode he's least viable in is Knockout and Heist, and now here's something interesting. I would not sleep on Poco in Heist of all modes because there's this strategy you can use specifically. Well, it's been a strategy in Kaboom Canyon, but that's not in the Power League rotation right now. But Safe Zone, there's this strategy where you pair Poco with Max and then any sort of tank. So usually that tank would be BB or Daryl or Primo. So you pair Poco, Max, and a tank of some sort that's able to do a lot of DPS, and you pretty much just walk in a straight line, press your tuning fork gadget, walk in a straight line, and just push to the safe repeatedly. You basically just walk towards the safe the entire game, and you just win sometimes. And that used to be like a super meta strat before draft, and in draft, obviously, you can counterpick against it, but it is something I would not sleep on right now. So if you ever get flattened by a Poco Max combo in Safe Zone, don't not tell me that slow down. Don't tell me that I did not warn you. I'm so sorry. It's been a while, so I'm stumbling over my words a little bit. However, what you shouldn't be, or what I'm not stumbling over, is my opinion that Poco is freaking insane right now. So, I mean, okay, so Poco as a standalone brawler, we've gotten into this. He can defend himself a little bit better. He does a lot of damage now, whatever. But the really interesting part about Poco is the combinations that you can make with him right now. So usually whenever I'm playing Power League right now, so Power League, Club League, whatever, and like against enemy comps and with my comps and seeing from competitive and other like high Power League gameplay, there's usually been like a common theme with how you like draft alongside a Poco, because whenever you have a Poco in your game, you usually want to draft towards a Poco-centric comp. It's kind of like Max, but Max is more of a standalone brawler than Poco, and Poco's like actual really good strengths come from his synergy with other brawlers. So the brawlers he most synergizes with is brawlers that have some combination of like high HP, insane range damage, and they're not weak at close range either, high mobility, and shields. So they have like, you can like pick 2 or 3 of these, for example, something like Max is pretty high damage, pretty high close range damage, and very high mobility, is really, really good with Poco, and that's like very classic combo right now. Poco and Max is pretty insane. But we've also seen like some damage-based combinations. I know I've seen Poco and Griff be like this really brainless strategy for for a hot zone. Poco and Griff, like Poco's in the amount of HP he gives to Griff alongside that business resilience star power that Griff already has, and with health gear on top of that, he makes Griff this unkillable monster, and then Griff just has infinite damage, infinite range, and just enemies cannot walk even remotely close to the hot zone. It's kind of disgusting. So, but there's also like the classic combinations. I know when people most often think about like a Poco synergy comp, they think of Poco tanks, right? Which I really don't think is the best way to play Poco right now, but Poco with tanks does work right now, and especially Poco with Pam is a really good combination. Pam herself combining high HP with really good ranged and close range damage. So it's a combination I wouldn't discredit right now, even though I don't think Poco tanks is necessarily the most flexible way to play him. It's still something, right? And then brawlers with shields, Poco really, really likes. I know Daryl and Carl are some meta options that people usually think about like tanky brawlers with shields, but also Colette has like a really crazy shield, and Colette with Poco is kind of like a gnarly combo. Like that's something I can see being really good on Safe Zone potentially, but it's also just something I would play in like Hot Zone and Brawl Ball. It sounds really, really gross. Even like Bounty, I could see it being good on Layer Cake. Like, Poco with Colette is something I probably wouldn't sleep on, even though it's personally not something I've really tried that much. I think I've played one game of Poco Colette, and it was pretty disgusting, even though my Colette missed a little bit of their supers. It was really, really powerful. No, I don't think you'll actually see that replay, but I did record it at one point, but I don't think it's going to be in this video. But, and I've heard, so that's basically what the Poco meta looks like. Poco got a damage buff, now he's letting his good traits that he already had, like his positive traits that he already had, he's letting them shine, and that's like affecting the meta in cool and unique ways. Poco comps are coming back, and these have been the best ways to use Poco. And I've seen some people, I mean, people been complaining about Nita being particularly annoying right now, but I don't think Nita is like the best right now, even though she also got an insane buff. Like, God, Nita doing like 1,300 damage and 1,400 damage and having a 5 hits to super like old Sandy, like that's nuts. Like, Nita kind of theoretically crazy, but she's still like really map dependent. But outside of that, like Nita and Poco and Griff, even Colette, people have been complaining that this meta is like really, really annoying. And like, I can get that. Like, Poco being good means that you're having the brawler that just like has infinite HP be good, and that's like really unfun to fight against. He's like low on HP and then he just heals 3,000 instantaneously. It's really annoying, but I really like it. And it's not because like I main Poco or anything. Like, I like Poco, right? I played a fair amount of Poco before he got buffed, but I think Poco, and it's something I've been thinking about, Poco has been like having an effect on the meta very similar to Carl. So it's not quite a Carl effect. Like, Poco does not have his own Carl effect. If you're unaware, by the way, I think I used the term before, but the Carl effect is basically where you have a brawler, and because this brawler, like where you have a brawler become good in the meta, right? And because the brawler has like really obvious counters, it's not that the brawler on their own makes these brawlers that counter them better, but it just gives these brawlers another reason to be played. Now, Poco is kind of like that. Like, obviously, like things that counter Poco are going to be a little bit better now, obviously, but it's a little bit different because Poco is surprisingly hard to counter with just like a single brawler. Like, there's no one brawler that Poco doesn't have a thing in his kit that he can't circumvent. Like, yes, he gets horribly, horribly outranged, but a lot of snipers can't really chew through the amount of HP he's able to output. Close range brawlers really don't like, tanks really don't like feeding Poco super, and tanks like Carl and Mortis and Daryl can really struggle with Poco's really good teammates. So it's not like Poco has a lot of single brawler counters, but Carl is like, or not Carl, Poco. Did I say Carl? Oh my God. Please have a counter for the amount of times I say Carl instead of Poco, because geez, I've been mixing those two up in my head for like, it's been like 2 days now, but yeah, Poco, whatever. Poco is not having quite a Carl effect, but he is highlighting something I like to call compound counters. Now, if you read the video title, I'm pretty sure this is going to be in the video title. You might have been waiting. It's like, hey, what are compound counters? And this is where I finally get to talk about them. Something I coined just this morning. And once again, it is an overly complicated term for something that is relatively simple. So a compound counter is basically a method of counterpicking in which you use multiple brawlers, or more accurately, a strategy to counter your opponent's strategy. So Poco, like what Poco is, he is a strategy. Like, Poco is a good brawler, but when you pick Poco, I mentioned previously, you want to be playing towards a Poco strategy. So in order to counter a Poco strategy, you can't really use a counter brawler, you need to use a counter strategy. And this is essentially the best way to counter Poco. So well, it doesn't only apply to Poco, but I think the most intuitive comparison, this has been a thing for a while. It's not like Poco is the only brawler that requires an opposing strategy in order to counter him. It's like something that usually separates the people who are good at drafting and the people who are not so good at drafting. And I think a good example of that is trying to counter tanks in Heist. So what tanks want to do, and what a tank strategy wants to do in Heist. So whether it be Gale tanks in Kaboom Canyon from last season, or just running double tanks on Safe Zone, like running Buzz Daryl on Safe Zone, or running Bull Buzz on Safe Zone, or whatever. Pit Shop too. That's a really tanky map right now. But basically, I find that a lot of people fail to counter, they have counter-pick brawlers to their strategies, and then they still lose to tank strategies in Heist. And that's because the way you're supposed to counter a tank strategy in Heist is that you need something that can slow down the tanks, obviously, right? You don't want the tanks to be able to just press their meat into your safe and just blow it up with their shotguns. You want to be able to prevent them from getting to your safe, but there's a problem there. Usually, when all tanks have to do is walk down the map, and that pushes you back automatically. So you need something a little bit more than just a single tank counter to defend them, right? You can't just keep getting pushed back by tanks. So the limited time you do have on the safe really, really has to count. So usually the best way to counter tanks in Heist is to have a tank counter, yes, but you also need something that can output a lot of safe damage. And so usually that comes in, and well, before I say that, this reveals something that's particularly interesting, and it's why Gale is not really a good brawler on Pit Shop and Hot Potato, even though Pit Shop and Hot Potato have historically been the tank Heist maps, and Gale is the tank counter. He doesn't really do a lot of safe damage. Yes, he can prevent the tanks from walking towards the safe most of the time. I mean, they can still sit behind walls, and they can still chip the safe, right? And they can keep respawning and keep pushing your team back, right? But Gale on his own can't beat the tanks because he doesn't do a lot of damage to the high safe. So when you finally kill the tanks, you walk up to their safe, you're not dealing as much damage as they just dealt to you in their push, right? But this is why Colette is the best quote-unquote tank counter in Heist, is because she's able to effortlessly defend the tanks while also doing a bunch of damage after defending the tanks with her super. That 5,600 damage to the safe is really, really nasty. So oftentimes this will come in the form, if it's not Colette specifically, it comes in the form of something like countering a tank with Griff and then also running Lola. Lola being able to output an insane amount of damage on the high safe while Griff can defend most safe pushes, or running B as a way to counter tanks in Safe Zone. I see that being really common. And then something I see people do whenever they do wrong in Safe Zone is that they just run B, and then they don't really have particularly high DPS brawlers. So pairing something with something that's really high DPS would be on Safe Zone. So in that situation, it would be again Lola, or it could be even Colt, or it can be Brock, or Amber even is something we saw in competitive. So you can't just run a tank counter, you also have to have a specific strategy, which is a tank counter with a high DPS brawler. Now, that example lasted way too long, but this also doesn't only apply to tank counters, it even can apply to the Carl effect itself, because something about the Carl effect is that Carl makes you want to stack a bunch of Carl checks on your team. Not necessarily counters, but brawlers that can prevent Carl from walking on your face. So a very common combination you'll see is Jean plus Leon, or Jean plus Stu. So Jean having that knockback ability so that Carl can never really super in, and Leon and Stu being able to outmaneuver Carl's attacks. So both of these brawlers don't necessarily hard counter Carl, but they have something that does counteract the mechanic of Carl. So this is yet another strategy. Multiple brawlers being used to counter a single strategy. Now, now that I've shown you that compound counters is something that's more than just with Poco, here's how I found to counter Poco. So usually, I did mention, so tanks can do well into Poco alone, but they tend to suffer against his teammates, the likes of Max, Stu, Pam, high DPS brawlers like Amber even, or Griff. They tend to struggle into his teammates. So the best method of countering him that I found is using some sort of CC brawler, crowd control, so stuns and slows, paired with a high DPS brawler. So usually that comes in the form of pairing like a Crow with a Griff, or a Squeak with a Griff, or a Surge with a Gale. Like Surge, not particularly a high DPS, but he is also a tank counter. So pairing 2 tank counters can also work. And this also shows, so basically like you are able to lock them down, right? And well, there's a reason why not just CC brawlers work and why not just DPS brawlers work. And it's because these CC brawlers usually don't have a lot of consistent individual DPS in order to chew through all the HP that Poco can output. And high DPS brawlers tend to be not able to like slow down in advance of a really fast team. So the likes of Max being able to outplay B, or the likes of what's his face, Griff being a little bit weak to, especially if you're running business resilience, being weak to being outmaneuvered by the likes of Stu. So high DPS brawlers tend to not be able to lock down the brawlers. So you need to really do both. But once you do both, once you do have CC, like avid CC and avid DPS, you're able to really punish that Poco strategy. And it doesn't just counter Poco, once again, it counters their whole strategy. So that type of counter pick can lead you to an instant game win. And obviously, you do have to play the game, but it gives you a huge advantage if you're able to do that. This also explains why B is the most quote-unquote consistent counter to Poco, because she theoretically does both. She shreds through his HP with her main attack, and her super is able to slow people. I mean, she's the all-in-one package. Now, I also see B being attributed as the best max counter in this meta, after Crow has been nerfed, of course. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think the only reason why she is being called the best max counter is because of how often Max is paired with Poco. It's not that B is countering Max or it's not like B is countering Max necessarily, it's that B is countering the Max Poco strategy. So this is just a little bit of like a little bit of a tidbit I've noticed. So B is a really good counter to Poco, but of course B is a little bit map dependent. So you do on other maps where you can't really necessarily use a brawler like B, you should be using those high DPS plus CC brawlers in order to counter Poco. And then I wrote down a few other like common compound counters. So in order to counter tanks on Brawl Ball, usually you use both a wall breaker and some sort of high DPS. So whether that be like Frank is a wall breaker plus B, or even Ruffs plus B, Ruffs plus Colette, all really good strategies. High regen comps with Poco himself, being able to counter stuff like Surge even, who has a slow reload speed, or snipers who don't do like a ton of DPS. So high regen comps with like Poco Pam especially, or Poco Max, are really able to counter these sniper comps. And I guess that's all I have to say about Poco himself. I guess the TLDR is that Poco has these interesting effects on the meta where every time Poco is picked, it's like not necessarily his individual strength is what's letting him shine. It's the fact that he got buffed and that he is stronger is making him being played more, right? Which is letting his individual benefits that he already brought to the table before the buff really shine through and affect the meta uniquely. Poco also creates strategies around him. So in order to counter Poco, you need to counter Poco strategies, which means you need to use whole counter strategies, compound counters. But yeah, start of season 14 is kind of wacky. I'll see whenever I can try to get my draft guide out for you guys amidst university and stuff and technical difficulties, but we'll see. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you watched all the way to the end, huge shout out to you. It's been really fun making this and just talking to myself in my room once again, and If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.